She was a celebrated CEO, untouchable in her world of power and prestige, until a quiet janitor stepped forward at her gala event and said 6 words that made the entire ballroom fall silent. "My daughter has your necklace." What happened next? No one could have predicted. Before we begin, if you believe in the power of second chances, hidden connections, and stories that remind us the past never truly leaves us, consider subscribing to our channel. Every week, we share heartfelt tales that prove kindness and courage can surface in the most unexpected places, even after decades of silence. Some secrets aren't meant to stay buried, and some bonds refuse to break, no matter how much time passes or how far apart lives drift. This is a story about truth, about sacrifice, and about a small piece of jewelry that held the weight of an entire lifetime. Now, let's begin. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The grand ballroom of Harrington Plaza gleamed under the crystal chandeliers, each prism catching light and scattering it across polished marble floors that looked like frozen water. The air hummed with the low murmur of success, expensive perfume mingling with the sharp notes of champagne, the rustle of designer gowns, and the confident laughter of people who had learned long ago how to own a room before they even entered it. Tonight was the annual Summit Ridge Business Excellence Awards, and every face in attendance belonged to someone who mattered. CEOs, investors, politicians, media moguls. They moved through the space like chess pieces, each one calculating their next move, each handshake a potential alliance, each smile a currency more valuable than the gold-trimmed plates lining the banquet tables. At the center of it all, standing beneath a spotlight that seemed designed just for her, was Juliana Tate. She wore a floor-length emerald gown that caught the light with every movement, her dark hair swept back in an elegant twist, her posture regal, unshakable. As the founder and CEO of Tate Global Innovations, one of the fastest-growing tech firms in the country, she had built an empire from nothing. 15 years ago, she had been a nobody with a business plan and a dream. Now, her company was worth billions. Her name appeared on magazine covers, and her voice carried weight in boardrooms across 3 continents. She raised her champagne glass to acknowledge the applause as the host announced her name, and the room erupted in the kind of applause reserved for those who had not just succeeded, but dominated. Juliana smiled, gracious, composed, every inch the woman who had clawed her way to the top and refused to apologize for it. But if you looked closely, if you knew where to look, you might notice the faint silver chain around her neck. It disappeared beneath the high neckline of her gown, but every so often, when she turned her head or reached for her glass, a small pendant shifted against her collarbone. It was delicate, almost invisible, a tiny compass rose etched into brushed silver, no larger than a dime. She never took it off. Not for photo shoots, not for board meetings, not even in the privacy of her own home. It had been with her for 23 years, and though no one ever asked about it, and though she never spoke of it, that necklace was the only thing she owned that money could never buy. Across the ballroom, far from the spotlight and the champagne towers, near the service entrance where the light grew dim and the marble gave way to scuffed tile, a man knelt beside a gray utility cart. His name was Ashton Walsh, and he wore the standard-issue navy blue uniform of the building's janitorial staff. His shirt was clean but faded, his boots worn at the heels, his hands calloused from years of work that left no trace except cleanliness. He was wiping down the base of a column, his movements slow and methodical, the kind of rhythm that came from doing the same task 1,000 times until it became muscle memory. He didn't look at the people in their gowns and suits. He didn't need to. He had learned long ago that in rooms like this, people like him were invisible, not because they were ignored, but because they were expected. A janitor was part of the scenery, like the chairs, the tables, the flowers in their crystal vases. Beside him, sitting on the bottom step of a service stairwell, was a young girl. She looked about 9 or 10, with light brown hair pulled into a ponytail and a navy blue dress that looked like it had been carefully ironed but was just a size too big. Her name was Lila, and she sat with her legs crossed, a small sketchbook balanced on her knees. a pencil moving carefully across the page. She wasn't watching the stage. She wasn't interested in the speeches or the applause. She was drawing. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the background hum of conversation and clinking glasses. "Is that her? The lady they keep talking about?" Ashton glanced up, following her gaze to the woman at the podium. Juliana Tate was mid-speech now, her voice clear and confident, speaking about innovation, resilience, and the future of technology. "That's her," Ashton said quietly, wringing out his cloth and folding it over the edge of the cart. "Miss Tate. She's the one who built this whole company." Lila's eyes widened, impressed. "She must be really smart." "She is," Ashton replied, his tone neutral, though something flickered across his face. Something old, buried deep. "One of the smartest people I've ever met." Lila tilted her head, curious. "You've met her?" Ashton paused, his hand hovering over the cart handle. For a moment, he looked like he might say something, but then he just shook his head. "A long time ago, she wouldn't remember me." Lila frowned, not satisfied with the bite the TASO answer, but she didn't press. Instead, she went back to her drawing, her pencil scratching softly against the paper. Around them, the gala continued. Waiters in crisp white shirts moved through the crowd with trays of hors d'oeuvres. A string quartet played softly from a corner stage. A photographer snapped pictures of Juliana shaking hands with the mayor, her smile perfect, her posture immaculate. Ashton returned to his work, wiping down the edges of a marble planter, checking the trash bins near the back wall, adjusting a crooked chair. He moved with the kind of quiet efficiency that came from years of being unseen, and he was good at it. He had to be, because being invisible meant safety. It meant stability. It meant Lila had a roof over her head, food on the table, and a father who showed up every single day. That was all that mattered now. But then Lila looked up again, and this time, something in her expression changed. She stared at Juliana Tate, not with the awe of a young girl watching someone powerful, but with recognition. Like she had seen something she wasn't supposed to see. "Dad," she said again, her voice different now. Sharper. More certain. Ashton turned. "What is it, sweetheart?" Lila pointed across the ballroom, her finger steady. "That lady. She's wearing your necklace." Ashton's entire body went still. Not tense. Not shocked. Just still. Like someone had pressed pause on the world and forgotten to hit play again. "What?" he said quietly. Lila stood up, closing her sketchbook and tucking it under her arm. She walked over to him, her small hand tugging gently on his sleeve. "The necklace. The one you have in the box under your bed. The little compass one." Ashton's throat tightened. He followed her gaze, and for the first time in 23 years, he let himself really look. Juliana Tate had just turned to greet someone, and as she did, the pendant shifted into view. Small, silver. A compass rose. Identical. His hand moved instinctively to his chest, where beneath his uniform shirt, tucked against his skin, hung a chain he hadn't taken off in over 2 decades. He didn't need to pull it out to know what it looked like. He had memorized every detail. The weight of it, the way the metal had warmed against his body over the years, the tiny engraving on the back that no one else had ever seen. "Stay close," he said. Ashton Walsh had not always been a janitor. There was a time, long ago, when his hands had held different tools, when his name had carried weight, when people had looked at him and seen potential instead of invisibility. But that was another life, and he had learned not to think about it too much. Thinking about it didn't change anything. It only made the nights longer. He had been 24 when everything fell apart. Fresh out of graduate school, top of his engineering class, hired by a startup that promised to change the world. And for a while, it felt like they might. The team was small, scrappy, brilliant. They worked 18-hour days fueled by cheap coffee and shared dreams. They built prototypes in a cramped garage, pitched investors in borrowed suits, celebrated small victories with pizza and beer. And at the center of it all was her. Juliana. Back then, she hadn't been a CEO. She had been Julian, the girl with wild ideas and wilder ambition, the one who could sketch out an entire business model on a napkin and make venture capitalists believe in it. She had been his partner, his co-founder, his best friend. And for one brief, fragile moment, she had been more than that. They had been building something together, not just a company, but a future. Late nights in the lab turned into early mornings at diners. Strategy sessions turned into long walks through the city. And somewhere along the way, in the quiet spaces between ambition and exhaustion, something shifted. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was Juliana who gave him the necklace first. A small silver compass, hung on a delicate chain. "So you always know which way to go," she had said, fastening it around his neck. Even when everything else is chaos. He had bought her one exactly the same the next day. A matching set. 2 compasses. 2 people trying to find their way. But then the funding fell through. The investors pulled out. The patents got tangled in legal battles. And when the company collapsed, it didn't just take the business with it, it took everything. Juliana had a choice to make. She could stay and rebuild from the ashes with him, or she could take the offer from a major tech firm that wanted to buy her ideas, her talent, her future. She chose the latter, and Ashton couldn't blame her. She had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let it all die because of one failed venture. But when she left, she took more than just her half of the patents. She took the only version of the story that mattered. The investors, the press, the industry, they all remembered her as the visionary founder. Ashton's name disappeared from the narrative, erased not by malice, but by time, by silence, by the simple fact that no one thought to ask where he had gone. He tried to fight it at first, sent emails, made calls, showed up at offices with documentation, proving his role in the early designs. But doors closed. Lawyers sent cease and desist letters. And eventually, he realized the truth. No one cared. So he stopped fighting. He took whatever work he could find. Odd jobs, night shifts, anything that paid enough to keep him fed and housed. And then, 3 years later, Lila was born. Her mother, a woman he had met during one of the hardest years of his life, passed away when Lila was just 2 years old. Suddenly, Ashton wasn't just trying to survive. He was responsible for someone else's survival. Janitorial work was steady. It didn't ask questions. It didn't require references or explanations. It paid enough, and most importantly, it let him be there for Lila. He worked night shifts when she was asleep, day shifts when she was at school. He packed her lunches, helped with her homework, read her bedtime stories, and he never, not once, took off the necklace. Now, as he stood in the shadow of the grand ballroom, watching Juliana Tate accept an award for innovation and leadership, he felt the weight of it against his chest. A reminder of what he had been, a reminder of what he had lost, but also a reminder that some things couldn't be erased. Juliana finished her speech to thunderous applause and stepped down from the stage, moving gracefully through the crowd. People reached out to shake her hand, to congratulate her, to bask in the glow of her success. She smiled, nodded, thanked them all, with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. But then, as she turned toward the refreshment table, her hand moved instinctively to her necklace. She touched it lightly, the way people do when they're checking to make sure something precious is still there. The pendant caught the light for just a moment, and Ashton saw it clearly. The compass rose, the delicate chain, the exact match to the one he wore. Lila was right. She was wearing his necklace. Or rather, she was wearing hers. The one he had given her 23 years ago. The one she had never taken off, just like he hadn't. Ashton's heart pounded in his chest, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with something far more complicated. Recognition. Memory. The ache of something that had never fully healed. He looked down at Lila, who was watching him carefully, her young face full of questions she didn't yet know how to ask. "Dad," she whispered. "Why does she have it?" Ashton exhaled slowly. "Because I gave it to her." Lila's eyes widened. "When?" "A long time ago," he said quietly. "Before you were born, before any of this." He glanced around the ballroom, at the marble floors he had just cleaned, at the chandeliers he would polish tomorrow, at the people who would never see him as anything more than part of the background. And then he made a decision. He stood up slowly, his knees aching slightly from hours of kneeling. He brushed off his uniform, straightened his shoulders, and took Lila's hand. "Come on," he said. "Where are we going?" she asked. He didn't answer. He just walked, steady and deliberate, across the ballroom floor, past the tables, past the champagne fountains, past the clusters of well-dressed guests who barely glanced his way, and he walked straight toward Juliana Tate. The crowd around Juliana Tate was thick, a wall of tailored suits and glittering jewelry, everyone vying for a moment of her time, a word, a glance, a chance to be remembered. She handled it with the grace of someone who had learned long ago how to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Smile. Nod. Thank you. So kind. Yes. We're very proud. Her responses were polished, automatic, the verbal equivalent of muscle memory. But then, the crowd shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a subtle parting, the way people instinctively step aside when someone moves with purpose. And through that gap walked a man in a janitor's uniform, holding the hand of a young girl in a too-big dress. At first, no one noticed. A janitor moving through a gala was not unusual. They were expected to be present, to refill water glasses, to clear plates, to remain functionally invisible. But this man wasn't carrying a tray. He wasn't moving toward the kitchen. He was walking directly toward Juliana Tate, and there was something in his posture, in the set of his jaw, in the steady, unblinking focus of his gaze, that made people pause. A waiter stopped mid-step. A city councilman's wife glanced over her shoulder. A photographer lowered his camera, sensing something was about to happen. Juliana was mid-conversation with a venture capitalist when she felt it. That prickling awareness that comes when someone is watching you, not casually, but intently. She turned, her practiced smile still in place, expecting another well-wisher, another handshake, another congratulations. Instead, she found herself looking into the eyes of a man she hadn't seen in 23 years. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. The years had changed him. His face was leaner, weathered, marked by time and hardship. His hair, once dark and full, was now streaked with gray at the temples. His hands, once smooth and quick with a pencil, were rough and scarred. But then he spoke, and his voice, that voice, was exactly the same. "Miss Tate," he said quietly, not loud, not aggressive, just steady, calm, like he had been practicing the words for years. Juliana's smile faltered. Her eyes narrowed slightly, confusion flickering across her face. "I'm sorry, do I?" And then she saw it. The necklace, just visible above the collar of his uniform. A small silver chain. A compass rose. Her hand moved instinctively to her own neck, fingers brushing the pendant hidden beneath her gown. Her breath caught. Her carefully maintained composure cracked, just for a second, and in that second, 23 years collapsed into nothing. "Ashton?" she whispered. The venture capitalist beside her glanced between them, confused. A few people in the crowd leaned in, trying to hear. The photographer raised his camera again, sensing a story. Ashton didn't smile. He didn't move closer. He just stood there, holding his daughter's hand. And when he spoke again, his voice carried across the sudden, heavy silence that had fallen over the immediate area. "My daughter," he said, his words deliberate, measured, each one landing like a stone dropped into still water. "Has your necklace?" The room didn't gasp. It didn't erupt in whispers. It simply froze. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. The string quartet in the corner finished their measure and didn't start another. Juliana stared at him, her face pale, her hands still pressed against her collarbone where her own necklace lay hidden. "What?" she breathed. Lila, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward slightly, her young voice clear and certain. "The compass, necklace," she said, looking up at Juliana with the kind of innocent directness only young people possess. "My dad has one just like it. He's had it forever. He keeps it in a box, but sometimes I see him hold it. And when I saw yours tonight, I knew it was the same." Juliana's eyes moved from Ashton to Lila, then back to Ashton. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked like someone who had just been handed a piece of a puzzle she thought she had lost decades ago, only to realize it was the one piece that made the entire picture make sense. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice shaking just slightly. What are you doing here?" "I work here," Ashton said simply. "I clean these floors. I empty these trash cans. I make sure this building looks the way it does. When you walk through it every day." A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Someone nearby inhaled sharply. The venture capitalist took a step back, suddenly unsure of his place in whatever was unfolding. Juliana's hand dropped from her necklace. Her expression shifted from confusion to something deeper, something raw. Guilt, recognition, pain. "I didn't know," she said softly. "I didn't know you were here. I didn't know you were." No." Ashton interrupted gently. "You didn't know. No one did. That's how it's been for a long time." A tall man in a charcoal suit, someone who looked like he might be on Juliana's executive team, stepped forward, his voice polite but firm. "Excuse me, sir, but this is a private event. If you have a concern, you can submit it through." "Let him speak," Juliana said sharply, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. The executive froze, then stepped back, his face flushing with embarrassment. Juliana took a slow breath. Her eyes locked on Ashton. "You gave me this necklace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, 23 years ago. "You told me it was so I'd always know which way to go." Ashton nodded. "And you gave me one too." She blinked, and for the first time since she had stepped onto that stage, since she had accepted that award, since she had smiled for the cameras and shaken hands with powerful people, Juliana Tate looked uncertain. "I thought you were gone," she said. "I thought, after everything fell apart, you'd moved on, started over somewhere else. I looked for you. I tried to find you, but you just disappeared." "I didn't disappear," Ashton said quietly. "I was erased." The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. Around them, people shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away. Others leaned in closer, unable to look away. Juliana's face crumpled slightly, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. "I didn't mean for that to happen," she said. "I swear, I didn't mean." "I know," Ashton said again, "but it did." Lila, who had been watching the exchange with wide, intelligent eyes, tugged gently on her father's hand. "Dad," she whispered. "Why is she crying?" Juliana wiped at her eyes quickly, trying to regain her composure, but the tears had already started. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, helpless tears that she couldn't quite control. "Because," Ashton said softly, looking down at his daughter, "sometimes people carry things for a long time without realizing how heavy they are. And when they finally see them again, it all comes back at once." He looked back at Juliana, and for the first time since he had walked across that ballroom, his expression softened. "I didn't come here to ruin your night," he said. "I came because my daughter noticed something true, and I thought maybe, after all this time, you'd want to know that some things don't just disappear, even when the world forgets them." Juliana nodded, unable to speak. She looked at him, at Lila, at the necklace around his neck, and something inside her, Something she had been holding onto for 23 years finally broke open. She took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and in a voice raw with emotion, she said, "I never stopped wearing it. I never took it off. Not once." Ashton's eyes shimmered, but he didn't look away. Neither did I. And in that moment, in front of hundreds of witnesses, beneath the glittering chandeliers of Harrington Plaza, the story that had been buried for over 2 decades finally began to surface. The private conference room on the 3rd floor of Harrington Plaza was quiet, insulated from the noise of the gala below by thick walls and heavy doors. Juliana had excused herself from the event, ignoring the confused looks and whispered questions, and led Ashton and Lila upstairs without explanation. Her assistant had tried to follow, but Juliana had waved her off with a sharp gesture that left no room for argument. Now, the 3 of them sat in the dimly lit room, surrounded by leather chairs and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. The lights of downtown stretched into the distance, a constellation of ambition and motion, but inside the room, everything was still. Lila sat near the window, her sketchbook open on her lap, drawing quietly while the adults talked. She understood, in the way young people sometimes do, that this conversation was important, that it needed space, and that her role right now was simply to be present and patient. Juliana sat across from Ashton, her hands folded on the table, her gaze fixed on the man she hadn't seen in over 2 decades. She had removed her heels, and her posture, so carefully maintained downstairs, had softened into something more human, more vulnerable. "I need you to understand," she said finally, her voice low and careful, "that I didn't know. I didn't know they had written you out of everything. I didn't know your name wasn't on the patents. I didn't know until it was too late." Ashton leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. He didn't look angry. He looked tired. "When did you find out?" Juliana closed her eyes, the memory sharp even after all these years. 6 months after I signed with Meridian Technologies. I was going through the acquisition paperwork, and I noticed your name wasn't anywhere. Not on the founding documents, not on the patent filings, not even in the footnotes. I called the lawyers. They told me your contributions had been classified as consulting work, not co-founding work. They said it was cleaner that way, less complicated. Ashton's jaw tightened. "Cleaner." "I fought it," Juliana said quickly, her voice rising slightly. "I went back to them. I threatened to walk away from the deal. But they had already filed everything. The contracts were signed. The press releases had gone out. And they told me that if I tried to change it, the whole thing would collapse. The investors would pull out. The company would die before it even started." She looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together. "I told myself it was temporary. That once we were stable, once we had momentum, I could go back and fix it. I could make sure you got credit. I could bring you back in." "But you didn't," Ashton said quietly. "I couldn't," Juliana whispered. "By the time I had the power to do it, too much time had passed. The narrative was already set. Tate Global was my company. I was the founder. And you were gone. I looked for you, Ashton. I swear I did. I hired a private investigator. I reached out to old contacts, but you had vanished. No forwarding address, no phone number, no trail. It was like you had disappeared off the face of the earth." Ashton was silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the city lights. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but there was an edge of old pain beneath it. "I didn't vanish," he said. "I just stopped being visible." Juliana looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "What happened to you?" He exhaled slowly, gathering the pieces of a story he hadn't told anyone in years. "After the company collapsed, I tried to keep going. I applied for jobs, sent out resumes, reached out to everyone I knew in the industry, but no one wanted to hire the guy who couldn't make his own startup work. And when your name started appearing in all the press, when Tate Global started taking off, people assumed I had been pushed out for a reason. They assumed I wasn't good enough. Juliana's face twisted with guilt. That's not true. I know, Ashton said. But it didn't matter what was true. It mattered what people believed. And they believed you were the genius, and I was the dead weight. He paused, his hand moving unconsciously to the necklace beneath his shirt. I did odd jobs for a while. Construction, delivery driving, freelance design work when I could get it. And then I met someone. A woman named Grace. She was kind. She didn't care about my past or my failures. We had Lila together. He glanced over at his daughter, who was carefully shading in the edges of a star in her drawing. Grace got sick when Lila was 18 months old. Cancer. She fought it for 6 months, but it spread too fast. By the time Lila turned 2, I was alone with a toddler and no real career to fall back on. Juliana's hand moved to her mouth, her breath shaking. I'm so sorry. I needed steady work, Ashton continued. Something reliable. Something that didn't ask too many questions or require a spotless resume. Janitorial work paid the bills. It let me be there for Lila. And honestly, after everything, I didn't mind being invisible. It was easier than trying to prove I had once been someone. The room fell silent, except for the faint sound of Lila's pencil moving across paper. Juliana stared at Ashton, seeing not the janitor in the faded uniform, but the man she had once stayed up with until 3 in the morning, sketching out prototypes and arguing about code architecture. The man who had believed in her when no one else did. The man she had loved, even if she had never been brave enough to say it out loud. I wore the necklace every day, she said softly. Even when I didn't know where you were. Even when I thought I'd never see you again. I wore it because it reminded me of who I was before all of this. Before the money and the power and the awards. It reminded me of the person I was, when it was just the two of us in that garage, trying to build something that mattered. Ashton looked at her, and for the first time since he had walked into that ballroom, his expression softened. I wore mine for the same reason. Juliana reached up and pulled the necklace out from beneath her gown, letting it rest against her collarbone in full view. The small silver compass caught the light, and Ashton could see every detail. The etched lines, the tiny arrow pointing north, the delicate chain that had survived decades of wear. He reached beneath his uniform shirt and pulled out his own. Identical. Worn. But unbroken. They sat like that for a long moment. Two people connected by a piece of jewelry that had outlasted everything else. Ambition, success, betrayal, time. I should have fought harder, Juliana said, her voice breaking. I should have made them put your name back on everything. I should have walked away from the deal if they refused. I chose my career over you, and I've regretted it every single day since. Ashton shook his head slowly. You made the only choice you could. If you had walked away, everything we built would have been for nothing. At least this way, the work survived. The ideas we had, the designs we created, they became something. That matters. But you didn't get to be part of it, Juliana said, tears streaming down her face now. You didn't get the recognition. You didn't get the success. You got erased. I got Lila, Ashton said simply, looking over at his daughter. And that's not nothing. Lila looked up from her drawing, sensing her name. Are you guys okay? She asked, her young face full of concern. Juliana smiled through her tears and nodded. We're okay, sweetheart. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Because sitting across from her was the man who should have been her partner, her equal, her co-founder. And instead, he was a janitor in a building she owned, cleaning floors she walked across without a second thought. And that was not okay. That was not even close to okay. I want to fix this, Juliana said, her voice firm now, determined. I don't care how long it takes or what it costs. I want your name back on those patents. I want the world to know what you did. I want to make this right. Ashton looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head gently. I don't need the world to know. I just needed you to remember. But you deserve more than that. Juliana insisted. Maybe. Ashton said. But what I need right now is for Lila to see that even when things are hard, even when the world forgets you, you don't give up. You don't become bitter. You just keep moving forward. Juliana wiped her eyes and nodded slowly. Then let me help you move forward. Please, let me do something. Ashton was quiet, considering. Then he said, there's a scholarship fund for young people who want to study engineering but can't afford it. If you want to help, put some money there. In Grace's name, let something good come from all of this. Juliana nodded, a small, sad smile crossing her face. I can do that, but I'm going to do more. Whether you want me to or not. Ashton didn't argue. He just looked at her, and in that look was everything they had once been, everything they had lost, and everything that still remained. Fragile but unbroken, like the silver compasses they both still wore. 3 days after the gala, Juliana Tate did something she hadn't done in 15 years. She cleared her entire schedule. No meetings, no conference calls, no appearances. Her assistant had looked at her like she'd lost her mind, but Juliana had been firm. She needed time, she needed space, she needed to think. She spent the first day in her office, surrounded by stacks of old files she had pulled from storage. Contracts, patent filings, acquisition documents, incorporation papers. She went through every single page, looking for Ashton's name, looking for proof of his contributions, looking for anything that might help her understand how he had been so completely erased. And what she found made her sick. It hadn't been an accident. It hadn't been a clerical error or an oversight. It had been deliberate. The lawyers at Meridian Technologies had systematically removed Ashton's name from every document, reclassifying his role from co-founder to consultant, from partner to contractor. They had done it quietly, efficiently, and by the time Juliana had noticed, the legal framework was already set in stone. She found emails she didn't remember seeing, memos she had never been copied on, clauses in contracts she had signed without reading closely enough. And beneath it all, a clear strategy: make Juliana Tate the sole face of the company, the singular genius, the visionary founder. One person was easier to market than two. One story was cleaner than a partnership. They had erased Ashton because it was good for business. On the second day, Juliana drove to the building where Ashton worked, not Harrington Plaza, but a smaller office complex on the east side of the city, one of several properties her company managed. She found him in a maintenance closet, organizing cleaning supplies, his uniform sleeves rolled up, his hands busy. "Can we talk?" she asked from the doorway. Ashton looked up, surprised. "Here?" "Anywhere," she said. "I just need to talk." They ended up in a small break room, sitting across from each other at a scratched plastic table with flickering fluorescent lights overhead. It was a far cry from the private conference room at Harrington Plaza, but somehow it felt more honest. Juliana placed a folder on the table between them. "I went through everything. All the old files. All the contracts. I found out what they did." Ashton glanced at the folder, but didn't open it. And you were right," Juliana said, her voice tight. "They erased you on purpose. The lawyers at Meridian restructured the whole deal to make me the sole founder. They buried your contributions in footnotes and reclassified your role to make it look like you were just a hired contractor." Ashton's expression didn't change. "I figured as much. I'm so angry I can barely see straight," Juliana continued, her hands clenched into fists on the table. "I trusted those people. I thought they were helping me build something great, but they were just protecting their investment, and they didn't care who they hurt in the process." "Welcome to business," Ashton said quietly. Juliana looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the weariness in his eyes, the resignation. This wasn't news to him. He had lived with this truth for over 20 years. He had made peace with it, or at least learned to carry it without letting it destroy him. "How are you not furious?" she asked. "How are you sitting here so calmly when they stole everything from you?" Ashton leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "I was furious. For years, I was so angry I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I couldn't think about anything else. But then Lila was born, and I realized I had a choice. I could spend the rest of my life being angry at people who would never care, or I could focus on being the best father I could be. So I chose her, and the anger just faded. Juliana shook her head in disbelief. I don't think I could do that. I don't think I could just let it go. You didn't have to, Ashton said simply. You got to be successful. You got to build the life you wanted. I'm glad you did. I mean that. Someone should have gotten something good out of all that work. But it should have been both of us, Juliana insisted, her voice rising. We built that company together. We came up with those designs together. You were just as responsible for the success as I was. Maybe, Ashton said. But that's not how the story got told, and I can't change that now. Juliana reached across the table and grabbed his hand, startling him. But I can. I have the power now. I have the resources. I can go back and correct the record. I can make sure people know the truth. Ashton looked down at her hand on his, and for a moment, he let himself remember what it had been like when they were partners, when they had believed they could change the world together. Then, he gently pulled his hand back. I appreciate that, he said. But I don't need vindication. I don't need my name in the press or on a plaque somewhere. What I need is to make sure Lila has a good life. That's all that matters to me now. Juliana sat back, frustrated but also moved by his humility, by his refusal to let bitterness consume him. Then let me help with that. Let me set up a trust for her education. Let me make sure she has every opportunity you didn't get. Ashton hesitated, his pride warring with his practicality. I don't want charity. It's not charity, Juliana said firmly. It's repayment. For everything you gave me. For everything you sacrificed. For everything you lost because I wasn't strong enough to fight for you. Ashton was quiet for a long time, his jaw working as he considered her words. Finally, he said, if you do this, it has to be for her, not for me. I don't want anything that comes with strings attached or expectations. No strings, Juliana promised. Just a chance for Lila to have the future she deserves. Ashton nodded slowly. Okay, but on one condition. What? You stop blaming yourself, he said, his voice gentle but firm. What happened wasn't your fault. You were young. You were ambitious. You trusted the wrong people. That doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. Juliana's eyes filled with tears again, and she didn't try to stop them this time. I should have been better. We all should have been, Ashton said. But we do the best we can with what we know at the time. And then we try to do better going forward. They sat in silence for a while, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, the sound of distant traffic filtering in through the small window. Two people who had once dreamed together, lost each other, and somehow found their way back, not to what they had been, but to something new, something honest. Can I ask you something? Juliana said finally. Of course. Why did you keep the necklace? After everything that happened, why didn't you just throw it away? Ashton touched the chain beneath his shirt, feeling the familiar weight of the compass. Because it reminded me of a time when I believed in something bigger than myself. When I believed that good ideas and hard work could change the world. I didn't want to lose that. Even when everything else fell apart, I wanted to remember that feeling. Juliana pulled her own necklace out, holding the compass in her palm. I kept mine for the same reason, and also because it reminded me of you. Of the person who believed in me. Before anyone else did. I didn't want to forget that. I didn't want to forget where I came from. And did you? Ashton asked. Forget? Juliana shook her head. Never. Not for a single day. Juliana Tate was not the kind of person who let things go. Once she decided to act, she moved with the precision and determination that had made her one of the most successful CEOs in the country. And now, with the truth about Ashton's erasure laid bare in front of her, she had a new mission: uncover exactly how deep the corruption went and who was responsible. She started by hiring a forensic accountant and a legal team specializing in intellectual property disputes. She gave them full access to every file, every contract, every email from the early days of Tate Global, and she told them to follow the trail, no matter where it led. What they found was worse than she had imagined. The lead investigator, a sharp woman named Rianne Vaughn, presented her findings in Juliana's office 1 week later. She spread a series of documents across the desk, each one marked with highlighted sections and handwritten notes. It wasn't just Meridian Technologies, Rianne said, her voice clipped and professional. They were the ones who restructured the contracts, but the decision came from higher up. Your original investors, the ones who backed you in the early days, they were the ones who pushed for Ashton Walsh to be removed from the records. Juliana's stomach dropped. Why would they do that? Risk mitigation, Rianne explained. When they ran background checks on both of you, they found that Ashton had no significant personal wealth, no influential connections, and no media presence. You, on the other hand, had graduated from a top-tier university, had family connections in finance, and fit the profile of what they called a marketable founder. Marketable, Juliana repeated, the word bitter on her tongue. They saw him as a liability, Rianne continued. If the company failed, they wanted to be able to pivot quickly, rebrand, and try again. Having two founders complicated that, so they structured the acquisition in a way that effectively wrote him out. They classified his contributions as work for hire, which meant he had no ownership stake and no claim to the intellectual property. Juliana felt her hands trembling with rage. And no one thought to tell me this. You were told, Rianne said gently, sliding another document across the desk. This is an email from your lead investor, sent 2 weeks before the Meridian deal closed. It explicitly states that Ashton Walsh's role was being reclassified and that the company would move forward with you as the sole founder. Juliana scanned the email, her heart sinking as she read her own response at the bottom. A single line. If this is what's best for the company, I trust your judgment. She closed her eyes, the weight of her own complicity crashing down on her. I don't remember this. You were managing a dozen things at once, Rianne said. It's possible you skimmed it and didn't fully process what it meant. Or it's possible you understood, but convinced yourself it was temporary. That doesn't make it okay, Juliana said quietly. No, Rianne agreed. It doesn't. Juliana opened her eyes and straightened in her chair, her expression hardening. Can we fix it? Legally, is there any way to restore his name to the original patents and founding documents? Rianne hesitated. It's complicated. The patents were filed over 20 years ago. The statute of limitations on most intellectual property claims has long since passed. But there are options. We could issue a public correction. We could add an addendum to the company's official history. We could create a retroactive founders agreement that acknowledges his contributions. Do all of it, Juliana said without hesitation. I don't care what it costs or how long it takes. I want his name on everything it should have been on from the beginning. Rianne nodded and made a note. There's one more thing you should know. What? Ashton Walsh never signed away his rights, Rianne said carefully. We couldn't find any documentation showing that he agreed to the reclassification, which means, technically, he may still have a legal claim to partial ownership of the original intellectual property. Juliana's eyes widened. Are you saying he could sue me? He could, Rianne confirmed. But based on everything we've found, I don't think he will. He's had over 20 years to come forward, and he hasn't. That suggests he either doesn't know, doesn't care, or has chosen not to pursue it. Juliana thought back to her conversation with Ashton in the break room, to the way he had said he didn't need vindication, didn't need recognition. He wasn't interested in revenge. He just wanted to move forward. But that didn't mean she couldn't make things right anyway. Over the next 2 weeks, Juliana worked with her legal team to draft a comprehensive correction plan. They would reissue the founding documents with Ashton's name listed as co-founder. They would add his name to the original patents, with a public acknowledgement that his contributions had been improperly excluded. They would create a permanent exhibit in the Tate Global headquarters honoring the company's true origins. And they would establish a significant financial settlement, not as charity, but as the share of the company's success that should have been his all along. But before any of it could be made official, Juliana needed Ashton's permission. So she asked him to meet her one more time. This time, at a small coffee shop far from the corporate offices, far from the scrutiny of employees and press. He arrived in his usual work clothes, looking tired but calm. They sat by the window, steaming mugs between them, and Juliana laid out everything her team had discovered. Ashton listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the people passing by on the street. "You want to give me money," he said finally. "I want to give you what you're owed," Juliana corrected. "What you should have received 23 years ago. And you think that will fix things?" "I think it's a start." Ashton turned to look at her, and his eyes were sad but not unkind. "Juliana, I don't need your money. I don't need my name on a plaque. I told you that already." "I know," she said, "but this isn't just about you. It's about the truth. It's about making sure that what happened to you doesn't happen to someone else. If I let this stay buried, I'm complicit. I'm part of the problem." Ashton considered that, then nodded slowly. "Okay, but if we do this, we do it my way." "What does that mean?" "It means no press conferences. No big announcements. No making me into some kind of victim who needs to be rescued. You can correct the records. You can put my name back where it belongs. But I'm not going to be part of the story. I'm just going to keep living my life." Juliana smiled, a small, genuine smile. "Deal." They shook hands across the table, and for the first time in 23 years, it felt like the scales were starting to balance. The correction didn't happen quietly, no matter how much Ashton had wanted it to. 3 weeks after Juliana's legal team submitted the amended founding documents to the patent office, a junior reporter at the Business Chronicle noticed something unusual. A major tech company, one of the most successful in the country, had just retroactively added a co-founder to its official records, someone whose name had never appeared in any press materials, any interviews, any company histories for over 2 decades. The reporter started digging. Within 48 hours, she had tracked down Ashton's employment records, discovered he was working as a janitor in a building owned by Tate Global, and connected the dots to the necklace incident at the gala that several attendees had posted about on social media. The story broke on a Tuesday morning with a headline that made Juliana's blood run cold. Tech giant admits erasing co-founder, now works as janitor in her building. By noon, it had been picked up by every major news outlet. By evening, it was trending on social media. And by the next morning, Ashton's face, pulled from an old university yearbook photo, was everywhere. Ashton was replacing a light bulb in a third-floor hallway when his phone started ringing. He ignored it. It rang again, and again. By the time he climbed down from the ladder, he had 17 missed calls, 43 text messages, and his voicemail was full. He called Juliana. "I know," she said before he could speak, her voice tight with stress. "I'm so sorry. We tried to keep it contained, but someone leaked it to the press. My PR team is working on damage control, but it's spreading fast." Ashton sat down on the bottom step of the stairwell, suddenly exhausted. "What do they want from me?" "Interviews, mostly," Juliana said. "Everyone wants to hear your side of the story, but you don't have to talk to anyone. I can have my team issue a statement on your behalf." "What kind of statement?" "Whatever you want it to say. That you're grateful for the correction, that you want privacy, that you're focused on your family, anything." Ashton rubbed his face with his free hand. "And if I don't say anything, then they'll fill in the blanks themselves. And trust me, the story they tell won't be the one you'd want." He was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, Let me talk to Lila first. She should hear about this from me, not from kids at school who saw it online. That evening, Ashton sat with his daughter at their small kitchen table. Her homework was spread out in front of her, math problems she had been working through before he got home. He pushed the papers aside gently and took her hands. "Something happened today," he said. "Something that's going to make a lot of people start paying attention to us. To me, specifically." Lila's eyes widened. "What kind of attention?" "The news found out about Miss Tate and me, about how we used to work together, and how my name got left off the company records. And now people are talking about it. A lot of people. Is that bad?" Lila asked. "I don't know yet," Ashton admitted. "But it might mean that reporters try to talk to you, or that people at school ask you questions. And I want you to know that you don't have to answer anyone. You don't owe anyone an explanation about our lives." Lila nodded slowly, processing. Then she said, "Are you in trouble?" "No, sweetheart. I'm not in trouble. But people are curious, and sometimes curiosity can feel overwhelming." "Do you want them to know," she asked, "about what happened to you?" Ashton thought about that. For 23 years, he had been invisible by choice, by necessity, by the simple fact that no one was looking. And now, suddenly, everyone was looking. The idea terrified him. But it also stirred something else, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The possibility that his story mattered, that what had happened to him could mean something to someone else. "I think," he said slowly, "that maybe it's time people knew. Not because I need recognition, but because maybe someone else out there is going through something similar. Maybe they're being erased, or overlooked, or forgotten. And maybe knowing they're not alone will help." Lila squeezed his hand. "Then you should tell them." 2 days later, Ashton agreed to do one interview. Just one, with a veteran technology journalist named Elise Porter, someone Juliana's team had vetted and trusted to handle the story with care. They met in the same coffee shop where Ashton and Juliana had talked weeks earlier. Elise arrived with a digital recorder and a notebook, her expression kind but professional. "Thank you for agreeing to this," she said as they sat down. "I know this can't be easy." "It's not," Ashton admitted, "but I think it's important." The interview lasted 2 hours. Ashton talked about the early days of the company, about the excitement and the hope, about the moment everything collapsed and the slow realization that he had been written out of the story. He talked about the years that followed, the struggle, the grief, the choice to focus on being a father instead of fighting a battle he couldn't win. And he talked about the necklace, about what it had meant to him and Juliana back then, and what it still meant now. A symbol of direction, of faith, of connection that survived even when everything else fell apart. Elise listened intently, taking notes, occasionally asking follow-up questions. When they finished, she turned off the recorder and looked at him with genuine respect. "This is going to resonate with a lot of people," she said. "Not just in tech, but everywhere. Everyone knows what it feels like to be overlooked." The article published 3 days later. It was thoughtful, thorough, and honest. It didn't paint Ashton as a victim or Juliana as a villain. It simply told the truth, that a brilliant young engineer had been erased from history by a system that valued marketability over fairness, and that he had spent the last 2 decades rebuilding his life quietly, without bitterness, with dignity. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the article had been shared hundreds of thousands of times. Comments poured in from engineers, janitors, single parents, people who had been overlooked or forgotten or pushed aside. They shared their own stories, their own erasures, their own quiet battles. A hashtag started trending. "Remember the forgotten." People began posting about colleagues whose contributions had been minimized, assistants whose ideas had been stolen by bosses, workers whose labor had gone uncredited. The story had touched something raw and universal. But the most unexpected response came from the engineering community itself. Within a week, a group of prominent tech leaders issued a joint statement calling for industry-wide reforms. They demanded transparency in founding documents, protections for early-stage contributors, and third-party audits of intellectual property claims. They cited Ashton's case as evidence of a systemic problem, one that had been ignored for too long. Universities began inviting him to speak. Professional organizations reached out. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell his story. Ashton declined most of it, but he accepted a few speaking engagements at engineering schools, places where young people were just starting their careers, where his story might actually make a difference. At one such event, a young woman approached him afterward. She was in her early 20s, nervous but determined. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "I've been working on a startup with my partner for 2 years, and last month, our investors told me they wanted to restructure the company with him as the sole founder. They said it would be easier for fundraising. I almost agreed." "What changed your mind?" Ashton asked. "Your story," she said simply. "I realized that if I let them erase me now, I'd spend the rest of my life regretting it. So I fought back. I hired a lawyer. I made sure my name stayed on everything. And we lost some investors because of it. But I don't care. At least I'll still be part of what we built." Ashton smiled, feeling something warm and unfamiliar in his chest. Pride, maybe. Or purpose. Good for you. Don't let anyone take what's yours. As the weeks passed, the attention didn't fade, but it did settle into something more manageable. Ashton went back to work, though Juliana had offered him a position in the company, a real position with an office and a title. He had declined, at least for now. He liked his routine. He liked being present for Lila. He liked the simplicity of his days. But he also knew that something had shifted. He was no longer invisible. And while that came with complications, it also came with something he hadn't expected: community, connection, the knowledge that his story had mattered to people he would never meet. One evening, as he and Lila sat on their apartment balcony watching the sun set over the city, she turned to him and said, "Dad, do you think things are better now that people know?" Ashton thought about it, watching the light fade from gold to amber to deep purple. "I think things are different, not perfect, but different, and maybe that's enough." Lila leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. In the distance, the city hummed with life, with stories, with people trying to find their way. And for the first time in 23 years, Ashton Walsh felt like he was part of it again. 6 months after the story broke, Tate Global held a special ceremony, not a gala, not a press event, just a quiet gathering in the company's main auditorium with employees, early investors, and a handful of carefully selected guests. Juliana had insisted on it, and this time, Ashton had agreed. The auditorium was simple but elegant, with rows of chairs facing a small stage. On the back wall hung a new installation, a timeline of the company's history, complete with photographs, patent documents, and founding papers. And there, at the very beginning, were 2 names in equal prominence: Juliana Tate and Ashton Walsh. Ashton stood backstage with Lila, who wore a navy dress she had picked out herself, slightly more formal than her usual clothes, but still comfortable. She held his hand tightly, sensing his nervousness. "You okay, Dad?" she whispered. "I think so," he said. "Just feels strange, being up in front of people like this." "You'll be great," she said with the confidence only young people can muster. "Just tell them the truth." Juliana appeared beside them, looking polished as always but with a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "Ready?" she asked. Ashton nodded. "As I'll ever be." They walked out together, and the room erupted in applause. Not polite, obligatory applause, but genuine, heartfelt recognition. Employees stood. Investors stood. And in the front row, sitting with a notebook on her lap, was Lila's teacher, who had brought several students from the engineering club to witness the moment. Juliana stepped up to the microphone first. Her voice was steady, but there was emotion beneath it, carefully controlled but unmistakable. 23 years ago, she began, Two young engineers sat in a garage and dreamed of building something that would change the world. They sketched designs on napkins. They argued about code architecture until 3 in the morning. They believed, truly believed, that their ideas could make a difference. She paused, looking directly at Ashton. I was one of those engineers. Ashton Walsh was the other. And for reasons that were wrong, reasons that I deeply regret, his name was removed from the story we told about this company's founding. Today, we correct that. She gestured to the wall behind her, where a large banner was draped. With a smooth motion, the banner dropped, revealing a plaque made of polished bronze. It read, "Founded by Juliana Tate and Ashton Walsh, two innovators who proved that great ideas are born from collaboration, persistence, and faith in each other." The applause swelled again, and Juliana stepped back, gesturing for Ashton to take the microphone. He hesitated, then walked forward, his heart pounding, but his step steady. He looked out at the crowd, at faces he didn't know and a few he did. And then he looked at Lila, sitting in the front row, her eyes shining with pride. "I'm not good at speeches," he began, his voice a little rough. "I'm better with tools than with words. But I want to say a few things." He took a breath. "What happened to me wasn't unique. It happens every day, in every industry. People's contributions get minimized. Their names get left off papers, and patents in credits. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's careless, but the result is the same. Erasure." The room was silent, everyone listening. For a long time, I was angry about it, and then I was resigned to it. I told myself it didn't matter, that I had moved on, that my life was about other things now. And in some ways, that was true. I built a life I'm proud of. I raised a daughter who is smarter and braver than I ever was. He glanced at Lila, who was trying not to cry. But standing here today, I realized that it did matter. Not because I needed recognition or validation, but because the truth matters, accuracy matters, giving credit where it's due matters. And if my story can help even one person stand up and say, "My name belongs here too," then all of this will have been worth it. He stepped back from the microphone, and the applause was deafening. But what struck him most wasn't the noise. It was Lila, who had jumped to her feet and was clapping so hard her hands must have hurt, tears streaming down her face, her smile so wide it could have lit up the entire room. After the ceremony, people approached Ashton, shaking his hand, thanking him, sharing their own stories. One older man, a retired engineer, gripped his shoulder and said, "I worked on a project 30 years ago. My boss took credit for it, got promoted because of it. I never said a word. Thank you for saying what I couldn't." A young woman, fresh out of college, told him she had almost quit her job last month because her manager kept taking credit for her designs. "But then I read about you," she said, "and I decided to fight. I documented everything. I went to HR, and they listened. I got the recognition I deserved." Story after story, person after person, Ashton listened to them all, humbled and moved by the weight of their experiences, by the quiet courage it took to keep going even when the world refused to see them. As the crowd thinned, Juliana found him standing alone near the timeline wall, studying the photographs of their early days. She stood beside him, both of them looking at a picture of two young people in a garage, laughing, surrounded by wires and circuit boards and possibility. "We were so young," Juliana said softly. "We were," Ashton agreed. "We thought we could change everything. We did change things," she said, "just not in the way we expected." He turned to her. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had gone differently? If your name and mine had stayed together from the beginning?" Juliana was quiet for a moment, considering. "I used to, but now I think everything happened the way it was supposed to. Not because it was fair, but because it led us both to where we needed to be. You became the father Lila needed. I became the leader this company needed. And now, finally, we get to acknowledge the truth." Ashton nodded slowly. "I can live with that." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who had built something, lost it, and found their way back, not to what they had been, but to something better, something honest. 3 weeks after the ceremony, Ashton received a package at his apartment. It was small, wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note on Age stationery. The note read, "Mr. Walsh, my name is Cole Palmer. I was an associate at the law firm that handled your company acquisition 23 years ago. I've followed your story in the news, and I believe there are things you should know. The files on this drive contain documents that were never meant to surface. I kept copies because I knew, even then, that what we did was wrong. I was too afraid to speak up at the time. I'm not anymore. You deserve the whole truth." Ashton stared at the note for a long time before plugging the USB drive into his laptop. What he found made his blood run cold. There were emails, dozens of them, between the lead investors and the law firm. They detailed a deliberate strategy to remove Ashton from the company's founding documents. But it went deeper than he had realized. The investors hadn't just wanted him removed for marketing purposes. They had wanted him gone because they were planning to sell the company's core technology to a larger corporation. And they knew Ashton would object. One email, dated 6 months before the acquisition, was particularly damning. It read, "Walsh is too idealistic. He'll never agree to license the patents to defense contractors. We need him out of the picture before the Meridian deal closes. Restructure the founding agreements and reclassify his role. Make it clean." Ashton felt sick. The technology he and Juliana had developed, the designs they had created in that garage, had been intended for civilian use. Educational tools, communication devices, things that would help people. But according to these documents, within 2 years of the acquisition, major portions of the technology had been licensed to military contractors for surveillance and weapons systems. And Juliana had been the CEO when it happened. He sat back in his chair, his mind racing. Did she know? Had she known back then, or had she been kept in the dark just like he had been? And if she had known, had she agreed to it? He needed answers. But more than that, he needed to know if the woman who had fought so hard to restore his name, the woman who wore a compass necklace to remember their shared ideals, had compromised those ideals for profit. The next day, he went to Juliana's office unannounced. Her assistant tried to stop him, but Juliana heard the commotion and came out herself. "Ashton, what's wrong?" she asked, seeing the look on his face. "We need to talk," he said. Privately. She led him into her office and closed the door. He placed the USB drive on her desk. "What's this?" she asked. "The truth," he said, "or at least another layer of it." He explained what was on the drive, watching her face carefully as he spoke. He saw confusion, then shock, then something that looked like horror as the full implications sank in. "Let me see," she said, her voice tight. He pulled up the emails on her computer, and she read through them in silence, her face growing paler with each one. When she finished, she sat back in her chair, her hands shaking. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know they planned this." "But you knew about the defense contracts," Ashton said. It wasn't a question. Juliana closed her eyes. "Yes, I knew about those. The board pushed for them 2 years after the acquisition. They said it was necessary for growth, for profitability. I argued against it at first, but I was outvoted. And eventually, I convinced myself it was acceptable, that the technology could serve multiple purposes, that we were still doing good work in other areas. We built those designs to help people," Ashton said, his voice hard. "Not to surveil them, not to weaponize communication." "I know," Juliana said, her voice breaking. "And I've regretted it every single day since. That's part of why I wore the necklace, to remind myself of what we originally stood for. To remind myself not to compromise again. But you did compromise, Ashton said. You let them turn our work into something we never intended. Yes, Juliana admitted, tears streaming down her face now. I did. And I can't take that back. I can't undo those contracts or recall that technology. All I can do is try to be better going forward. Ashton stood, pacing the office, trying to process everything. They wanted me gone because they knew I'd fight this. They knew I'd never agree to military applications. You're right, Juliana said. And I should have fought harder too. I should have walked away when they first proposed it. But I was afraid. Afraid of losing everything I'd built. Afraid of being seen as difficult, or idealistic, or naive. She looked up at him. Her eyes red. I failed you, Ashton. Not just by letting them erase your name, but by letting them corrupt the work we did together. And I don't know how to make that right. Ashton stopped pacing and turned to face her. For a long moment, he just looked at her, seeing not the powerful CEO, but the young woman he had once dreamed with, the one who had believed they could change the world. You can't make it right, he said finally. The past is done. But you can make sure it doesn't happen again. You can fight to end those defense contracts. You can redirect the company toward the original vision. You can be the person you were supposed to be before they twisted everything. Juliana nodded, wiping her eyes. I will. I promise you, I will. And you need to go public with this, Ashton added. These emails, this whole conspiracy. It needs to come out. Not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been pushed aside because they had principles. Juliana took a shaky breath. That will destroy the company. The board will force me out. The stock price will collapse. Everything I've built will fall apart. Maybe, Ashton said. Or maybe it's the only way to rebuild something worth saving. They sat in heavy silence, the weight of 2 decades of compromises and consequences pressing down on them both. Finally, Juliana nodded. Okay, she said, I'll do it. The press conference was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, deliberately timed to hit the news cycle. Before the markets opened, Juliana had spent the previous 3 days working with her legal team, preparing statements, reviewing documents, and bracing herself for the fallout. The board had called emergency meetings. Investors had demanded explanations. Her executive team had begged her to reconsider. But she had made her choice, and this time, she wasn't going to let fear or ambition cloud her judgment. The conference room at Tate Global headquarters was packed with journalists, cameras, and industry analysts. Juliana stood at the podium in a simple black suit, her hair pulled back, her face calm but serious. Beside her sat Ashton, who had insisted on being present, and her legal counsel. She began without preamble, her voice steady and clear. 23 years ago, I co-founded this company with a brilliant engineer named Ashton Walsh. Our vision was to create technology that would improve communication, enhance education, and bring people together. That vision was compromised, first by removing Ashton from the company's records, and later by licensing our core technology to defense contractors for surveillance and weapons applications. A murmur rippled through the room. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward. I recently discovered documents that prove my early investors deliberately orchestrated Ashton's removal from the company because they knew he would object to the militarization of our work. And they were right. He would have objected. He should have been there to object. But he wasn't. Because I didn't fight hard enough to keep him. Her voice wavered slightly. But she pressed on. Furthermore, I approved defense contracts that directly contradicted our original mission. I told myself it was necessary for growth, for stability, for the company's survival. But the truth is, I compromised our principles because I was more afraid of failure than I was committed to our values. The room was silent now, every eye fixed on her. Today, I am announcing several actions. First, Tate Global will immediately begin the process of terminating all defense-related contracts. Second, we will return all profits generated from those contracts, approximately $2.3 billion, to a newly established technology ethics foundation. Third, we will release all relevant documents regarding Ashton Walsh's removal to an independent investigative body. And fourth, I will be stepping down as CEO, effective at the end of this quarter. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras clicked furiously, but Juliana raised a hand, silencing them. I'm not stepping down because I've been forced to. I'm stepping down because leadership requires accountability. I failed to protect the integrity of this company. I failed to honor the partnership that built it. And I failed to live up to the ideals that Ashton and I once shared. It's time for someone with a clearer moral compass to lead this company forward. She turned to Ashton. I can't undo the past, but I can make sure the future looks different. And I can make sure that the next generation of innovators doesn't have to choose between success and integrity. When she stepped away from the microphone, the room exploded with questions, but she didn't answer any of them. She simply walked out, Ashton following close behind. The fallout was immediate and severe. Tate Global's stock price dropped 28% in the first hour of trading. 3 board members resigned. Major investors threatened lawsuits. Industry analysts called it corporate suicide. But something else happened too. Something unexpected. Within 48 hours, over 30 tech companies issued statements pledging to review their own defense contracts. A coalition of engineers and designers launched a petition demanding transparency in how their work was being used. Universities began incorporating ethics training into their engineering programs, and thousands of employees at tech companies across the country started asking questions about where their innovations were going and who was profiting from them. The movement that had started with a janitor and a necklace had become something much larger. It had become a reckoning. 6 months later, the landscape had shifted dramatically. Tate Global, under new leadership, had successfully transitioned away from defense work and refocused on educational technology. The company was smaller, leaner, but its mission was clear again. And while Juliana was no longer CEO, she remained on the board as an advisor, using her experience to guide the company back to its roots. Ashton had finally accepted a position at the company, not in management, but in research and development. He worked with a small team of engineers on projects that excited him, projects that aligned with the values he and Juliana had started with decades ago. And every evening, he went home to Lila, who was now thriving in an advanced engineering program at her school. Inspired by her father's story and determined to build things that mattered, the Technology Ethics Foundation that Juliana had established became one of the most influential organizations in the industry. It funded independent research, provided grants to ethical innovators, and created a certification program for companies committed to transparent and responsible technology development. Ashton served on the board, alongside other engineers and ethicists who had been marginalized or overlooked in their own careers. But perhaps the most meaningful change happened in the quieter spaces, in conversations between mentors and students, in startup meetings where founders asked harder questions about who their investors were and what strings might be attached, in company cultures that began to value integrity as much as innovation. One evening, nearly a year after the press conference, Ashton and Juliana met at the same coffee shop where they had reconnected months earlier. It had become a tradition of sorts, a monthly check-in where they could talk honestly, without the pressure of cameras or boards or public scrutiny. "How's Lila doing?" Juliana asked, stirring sugar into her coffee. "She's incredible," Ashton said, his face lighting up the way it always did when he talked about his daughter. "She's been working on a prototype for a communication device specifically designed for people with speech disabilities. She wants to present it at the regional science fair." "That's wonderful," Juliana said warmly. "She's going to change the world, just like her father did." Ashton shook his head. "I didn't change the world. I just told the truth." "Sometimes that's the same thing," Juliana replied. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching people pass by the window. Then Juliana reached up and touched the necklace at her throat. the small silver compass she had worn for over 2 decades. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what these necklaces really mean. We always said they were about finding direction, about knowing which way to go. But I think they're about something else too." "What's that?" Ashton asked. "They're about staying connected to who you are, even when the world is pulling you in a dozen different directions, even when it would be easier to compromise or forget or pretend your principles don't matter. They're a reminder that some things are worth holding on to, no matter what." Ashton pulled his own necklace out from beneath his shirt, letting it rest against his chest. "I think you're right, and I think that's why we both kept wearing them, even when it hurt to remember." "Do you think we did the right thing?" Juliana asked quietly. "Going public with everything? Sometimes I wonder if we caused more harm than good." The company lost billions. People lost their jobs. Investors lost money. People also started asking questions they should have been asking all along, Ashton said. "And maybe some young engineer somewhere will think twice before letting their work be used in ways they never intended. Maybe some founder will fight harder to keep their partner's name on the company. Maybe someone will choose integrity over profit because they saw what happened when we finally chose it too." Juliana nodded slowly. "I hope you're right." "I am," Ashton said with quiet confidence. "Because I've met those people. They come up to me at conferences, they send emails, they stop me on the street, and they tell me that our story mattered, that it gave them courage, that it reminded them why they got into this field in the first place." He paused, then added, "You know what the most common thing people say to me is?" "What?" "Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for staying true to yourself even when no one was watching." Juliana's eyes filled with tears. But she smiled. "We should have stayed partners from the beginning. We would have built something extraordinary." "We still did," Ashton said gently. "Just not in the way we expected. We built a story that mattered. We built a legacy that's bigger than any company or patent or product. We built something that reminds people that the truth is worth fighting for." Over the following years, their story continued to resonate. Books were written about them. Case studies were taught in business schools. Documentaries explored the intersection of ethics and innovation using their journey as a framework. But more importantly, real change happened. Legislation was passed requiring greater transparency in patent filings. Industry standards were established for ethical technology development. And a new generation of founders learned to ask harder questions and demand better answers. Lila grew into a remarkable young woman, brilliant and compassionate, carrying forward the lessons her father had taught her not through lectures, but through example. She went on to study engineering at a top university, and in her admissions essay, she wrote about a necklace, a compass, and a father who had shown her that true north wasn't about success or recognition. It was about staying true to your values even when the path was difficult. On her 18th birthday, Ashton gave her a gift, a small silver compass on a delicate chain, identical to the ones he and Juliana wore. On the back, he had engraved a single phrase, "Some things are worth holding on to." Lila put it on immediately and never took it off. One evening, 5 years after the press conference, Ashton stood in the newly opened Innovation and Ethics Center, a building funded by the foundation Juliana had established. Inside were laboratories, classrooms, and maker spaces where young inventors could develop their ideas with mentorship and support, free from the pressure of investors who might compromise their vision. On the wall near the entrance hung 3 silver compasses mounted in glass cases with small plaques beneath them. The first belonged to Ashton, donated to inspire future generations. The second belonged to Juliana, given freely as a reminder of lessons learned the hard way. And the third belonged to Lila, placed there temporarily for the center's opening but destined to be returned to her because she would need it for the journey ahead. Beneath the 3 compasses was a larger plaque that read, "These symbols remind us that direction matters more than speed, that integrity matters more than profit, and that the truest measure of success is whether we stayed faithful to who we were meant to be. As Ashton stood there, surrounded by young people, sketching designs and coding prototypes and dreaming of futures they would build together, he felt something he hadn't felt in over 2 decades. Not vindication, not revenge, not even satisfaction, just peace. The deep, abiding peace that comes from knowing your story mattered. Your choices made a difference, and the path you walked, however difficult, was the right one. Juliana found him there, standing in the glow of the late afternoon sun streaming through the windows. She stood beside him, both of them watching the next generation of innovators at work. "We did it," she said softly. "We actually did it." "We did," Ashton agreed. "Not the way we planned, not the way we imagined, but we did it." And in that moment, surrounded by young minds full of hope and possibility, 2 people who had been erased and restored, who had failed and fought, and finally found their way back to the truth, understood that their legacy wasn't a company, or a patent, or even a foundation. It was this: the knowledge that one person speaking truth, one person refusing to be erased, one person holding onto their compass even in the darkest times, could change everything. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily, surely, like a star that never moves, guiding everyone who looks up long enough to find it. 15 years later, the autumn sun cast long golden shadows across the university campus where it all began. The engineering building had been renovated since Ashton and Juliana's time there, but the old oak tree near the entrance remained, its branches now thick and sprawling, providing shade for students who gathered beneath it with laptops and notebooks, dreaming their own impossible dreams. Ashton stood beneath that tree, his hair fully gray now, his face lined with the kind of wrinkles that come from years of genuine smiles. Beside him stood Juliana, her own hair shorter than it used to be, streaked with silver she no longer bothered to hide. They had both aged gracefully, not fighting time but accepting it, wearing their years like badges of honor. They were waiting for someone. The campus was buzzing with activity. Students rushed between classes, professors discussed research over coffee, and somewhere in the distance, a bell tower chimed the hour. But Ashton and Juliana stood quietly, content to simply be present, to remember what it had felt like to be young and ambitious and naively certain they could change everything. "Do you ever miss it?" Juliana asked, her voice soft. "The early days, when we thought we had all the answers?" Ashton smiled. "I miss the confidence. But I don't miss being wrong about so many things." "We weren't wrong about everything," Juliana said. "We were right about the important parts." Before Ashton could respond, they heard a familiar voice calling out, "Dad, Miss Tate." They turned to see Lila hurrying toward them, now 24 years old and barely recognizable as the quiet girl who had once sat in ballrooms drawing compasses in her sketchbook. She had grown into a striking young woman, tall and confident, with her father's steady gaze and a determination that was entirely her own. She wore professional attire, a blazer over a simple blouse, and around her neck hung the silver compass necklace her father had given her years ago. Behind her walked a young man carrying a briefcase and a woman with a tablet, both looking slightly overwhelmed but excited. "Sorry we're late," Lila said, slightly breathless as she reached them. The patent office meeting ran longer than expected. "Good news?" Ashton asked, though he could already see the answer in his daughter's eyes. "The best news," Lila confirmed, her face breaking into a wide grin. The adaptive communication system patent was approved. Full credit to everyone on the team, transparent ownership structure, everything documented exactly the way it should be. Juliana reached out and squeezed Lila's hand. "Your father would be proud. I mean, he is proud. You know what I mean." Lila laughed. "I learned from the best. Both of you." The young man behind her stepped forward, extending his hand to Ashton. "Mr. Walsh, it's an honor. I'm Marcus Chen, one of Lila's partners. I just wanted to say thank you. If you hadn't told your story, if you hadn't fought for transparency in founding documents, our startup would probably look very different right now. You changed the whole industry." Ashton shook his hand, humbled as always by these moments. "I just told the truth. You're the ones doing the real work." "The truth changed everything," Marcus said simply. They walked together across campus toward the new Innovation Center, a building that had been funded jointly by the Technology Ethics Foundation and the university. Inside, a special exhibition was opening today, chronicling the history of ethical innovation in technology over the past 2 decades. Ashton and Juliana's story was featured prominently, but so were dozens of others, engineers and designers who had fought for transparency, who had refused to compromise their principles, who had built companies and products that prioritized people over profit. As they entered the exhibition hall, Ashton noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. In the center of the room, mounted on a rotating display, were 3 silver compass necklaces, the ones that had once hung on the wall of the original Innovation and Ethics Center. But now, there was a 4th compass beside them. He looked at Lila, who smiled sheepishly. "I donated mine for the exhibition, just temporarily. I wanted people to understand that this isn't just history, it's still happening. We're still making these choices every day." Ashton felt his throat tighten with emotion. He pulled his daughter into a hug, holding her close the way he had when she was small, when the world seemed impossibly large and frightening. But she wasn't small anymore. She was strong, capable, and carrying forward a legacy that meant more to him than any patent or company ever could. When he finally released her, he saw that Juliana was wiping tears from her eyes. "You raised an extraordinary human," Juliana said softly to Ashton. "We both did," he replied. Because over the years, Juliana had become part of their family. Not in any formal way, but in the ways that mattered. She had been there for Lila's graduations, her accomplishments, her struggles. She had been a mentor, a friend, a reminder that even people who make terrible mistakes can find their way back to who they were meant to be. As the exhibition opened and people began filtering through, reading stories, and examining artifacts, Ashton found himself standing in front of a particular display. It showed a photograph from that night at the gala 15 years ago, the moment when he had walked across that ballroom floor holding Lila's hand. Beneath the photo was a quote, his own words from an interview years later. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to disappear, refuse to let the world erase you, refuse to believe that your story doesn't matter. Because it does matter. Every story matters. Every voice deserves to be heard." A young woman, probably a first-year student, stood beside him, reading the same quote. She looked up at him, did a double take, and her eyes went wide. "You're him," she breathed. "You're Ashton Walsh." He smiled gently. "I am. I'm studying engineering because of you," she said, her voice shaking slightly with emotion. "I almost didn't apply because I didn't think I belonged here. I didn't think people like me, people without connections or money or perfect grades, could make it in this field. But then I read about you, about how you lost everything and rebuilt, about how you refused to give up, and I thought, if he can do it, maybe I can too." Ashton felt the familiar warmth in his chest, the feeling that never got old no matter how many times it happened. "You can," he said firmly. "And you will. Just remember to stay true to who you are. Don't let anyone convince you that success requires compromising your values." The young woman nodded, tears in her eyes, then impulsively hugged him before hurrying away to join her friends. Juliana appeared beside him again. "Does that ever get easier?" "No," Ashton admitted, "but I hope it never does. The day I stop feeling moved by stories like hers is the day I've forgotten why any of this mattered." They stood together in the center of the exhibition, surrounded by the evidence of change they had helped create, not through grand gestures or heroic acts, but through simple persistence, through telling the truth, through refusing to let the world forget. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Students were heading to dinner, to study sessions, to the next chapter of their lives. And somewhere among them were future innovators, future founders, future voices that would shape the world in ways no one could yet imagine. But they would do it differently than previous generations. They would ask harder questions. They would demand transparency. They would refuse to be erased or to erase others, because they had learned from those who came before. From a janitor who wore a compass around his neck and refused to disappear. From a CEO who chose truth over empire. From a young girl who noticed what others overlooked. As Ashton and Juliana walked out of the exhibition together, the silver compasses they still wore catching the last light of day, they understood that their story had never really been about them. It had been about everyone who came after, everyone who would face their own moments of choice, their own tests of integrity, and in those moments, perhaps they would remember. Perhaps they would look for their own North Star. Perhaps they would choose to stay true. That was legacy enough. That was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.